Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, September 17th, 2018. What a day. What a weekend. It's been kind of crazy. We'll have Brett Dworkin back here with us to try and help make some sense of it. Just as we come onto the air here today, I see that The Hill informs me that Senator Susan Collins, of all people, is knocking Democrats, it says, over the handling of the Kavanaugh sexual assault allegation. Well, I'll be doggone. She's just fantastic, isn't she? I'm deeply troubled by the fact that she can't, I don't know. This is the most feckless I think we've ever seen her, and I think this pretty much breaks the spell, I would hope, for folks up in Maine and really everywhere around the country. The idea that this woman ever entertained a moderate thought or thoughts of moderating, I have no idea why anybody would have thought so. I guess there are a couple of votes here and there that fooled you into thinking so, and certainly a series of public statements designed to make you think that she was carefully deliberating over everything, but well, she's pretty much exposed on this one. This is pretty gross. I don't even know. Should I bother reading what she's doing, knocking Democrats over the... I assume bringing it up at the last minute, et cetera, et cetera. Well, all of that breaks open today. The dam breaks open today. The weekend took care of that. I guess now that we're back on business hours, we'll be discussing it extensively in our own roundup, all over the media. I can't even remember whether this happened Friday and we knew it for the weekend or what day these things started to break wide. But I think Friday we had the allegations, of course, coming forward or being brought forward in the letter from a California constituent of Congresswoman Anna Eshoo and, of course, Senator Dianne Feinstein. And she initially wanted to keep her name out of the news because she's such an attention seeker and all of that stuff. But over the weekend, I guess it finally broke wide. I don't know. I imagine, or I think I read somewhere along the line that the name was leaked and then she eventually just said, the hell with it. My name's coming out anyway. I knew this was going to happen. I knew I was going to be attacked. I knew it was going to be, people were going to attempt to destroy me here. I'm doing it anyway. Coming forward with the allegation. So now there's a name put to it. And now, of course, it turns out there's been a track record behind it the whole time, too. Republicans, the initial Republican attack, of course, being, well, why didn't she say something at the time? Which is an amazing thing to say, by the way. I did see this morning that the Trump team's plans essentially are to attack her on those grounds. Why didn't she come forward at the time if this really happened to her? Well, a number of things wrong with that, not the least of which is, of course, that the team that says, why didn't she come forward and speak up at the time, is the one that actually ran a paid interference operation with the National Enquirer designed to shut women up if they came forward at the time or at any time if they were involved with Donald Trump or with anybody else. Who knows who else National Enquirer and whatever their parent ownership group was tied up in or mixed up in at the time. It's an astonishing thing. Not an astonishing thing, of course, that somebody who is himself alleged to be a serial sexual harasser, assaulter, and possibly rapist like Donald Trump would find himself picking out of the barrel of apples another equally bad apple or similarly bad apple, if not equally. No one can quite get to his level, I don't think, like Brett Kavanaugh. And I mean, truth is, honestly, there are enough bad apples out there that any president who chose their Supreme Court nominees more or less at random and outsourced the vetting to an outside interest group like the Federalist Society that has an interest in judicial outcomes and not the character of the people being nominated, somebody's going to make this mistake. That Donald Trump would make this mistake, if it is a mistake, is almost entirely predictable, of course. He'd never see any of this coming. And we're seeing now in the defense plans that had he seen it coming, it might have been considered a plus anyway. I don't really think so. I think Donald Trump is calculating enough, if not smart enough, to have realized that if before he named someone, before he committed to a nominee, information came to him that Brett Kavanaugh or whoever he was thinking of nominating had this allegation, at least in their background, he would have said, yeah, we're not going to go with that guy. I don't want that trouble. But once he's committed to it, now he feels like, oh, I look weak if I back off. So he's not going to. But again, an amazing thing to be saying, why didn't they come forward when he's been running a capture and kill operation for decades, making sure that no one could come forward. And if they did, that they were sued and or ridiculed out of existence. So in addition to all this, of course, comes information that she actually did tell someone about it, not necessarily contemporaneously, but several years, in fact, before Brett Kavanaugh was, I think, even under consideration for a federal judicial position the first time around. She apparently had spoken to a therapist because she had been essentially pretty badly damaged by this attack. And at the very least, she had this issue that she needed to work through. I don't know whether it's fair to say she was badly damaged. What I mean is she felt like she needed to talk to somebody. She might be perfectly intact, but angry. That's a perfectly acceptable reason to speak to a therapist about something like this. So I, don't want to go out on a limb and say the wrong thing here. I would imagine she's got it together by this point, enough to say, I need to speak up for the sake of the country anyway, and other women who may be similarly situated. So if she wasn't always that strong, I guess she's apparently gotten that way, perhaps with the aid of the therapist. But the real point is that she had made had made that claim to her therapist years ago, and I guess allowed for the notes to be released so that people could, I guess, if they really wanted to try to cling on to something that had the look and feel of prior evidence, they would be able to do that. And apparently that's important to some. It's high stakes here, so I guess it makes a difference. And amazing that she would even be willing to allow her therapist to share something like that. By the way, of course, it was immediately dismissed by Republicans and other conservative activists who insisted, I think I saw Con Carroll saying, well, the therapist's notes don't have Brett Kavanaugh's name in them, as they likely would not, because Brett Kavanaugh was not her patient. And it was almost assuredly irrelevant to the discussion between the Kavanaugh's accuser and her therapist. And honestly, I don't think any trained therapist would probably just say, you know what, unless it's actually directly relevant, maybe we keep this guy's name out of it. But certainly her notes wouldn't. But leave it to the Republicans to immediately say, well, there's no evidence. Here's the evidence. Well, this evidence doesn't say Brett Kavanaugh did this on this day. Okay, fine. Thanks for telling. Okay, well, they're textualists. They're originalists. So I suppose it's to be expected. Anyway, this is not the only thing happening, but it might as well be for the rest of the day. I don't know. We'll see what else we can round up. Greg Dworkin is here. He reads all kinds of news, including the writings of a lot of conservatives that had bad weekends and made bad tweets this weekend. Good morning, Greg. How you doing?
Good morning. Boy, this is going to be an ugly week.
Yes. Well, it was.
We don't pin tweets on radio, like you can't do that with sound, but that could be a pinned soundbite.
Yeah. This is going to be a rough one. We're only in our 87th week. There's still time for it all to come crumbling down before we get to 100, if you're into that sort of record keeping.
Right. So if you were sleeping the entire weekend and didn't know what was going on,
yes,
there was a whole lot that was going on. Of course, we had this big hurricane, lots of flooding in North Carolina, and more flooding to come. It ain't over. And all the idiots who kept saying, oh, it's only a Category 1, you're overhyping it. Wilmington, North Carolina, is essentially isolated from the rest of the country, and food needs to be flown in order to feed the people that were there, just to give you an idea of the flooding. So we have
Trump's good at that.
We have our FEMA director, Brock Long, totally in charge, explaining to people that when asked about Trump's dismissal of the people who died in Maria in Puerto Rico, said that, well, to be fair, a lot of those deaths might have been spousal abuse, which happens after disasters.
Oh, good. That's terrific. Okay.
Right. And so he's already being investigated by using car service inappropriately, like most of the cabinet members use stuff. They fly, yes. He drives. But the important part there, he is the only experienced disaster manager in the high echelon ranks of FEMA. There is no second because they never confirmed. And the third in command has no experience in actually managing disasters, and we're in the middle of one. Not the Kavanaugh nomination, but the hurricane. And so you have people at FEMA who really are unequipped for the job. And Brock Long's entire philosophy, which comes from when he was director of emergency management in Florida, is it's up to the states.
Okay.
The states should do this. Like the federal government only does this as an absolutely last resort. It's your problem. And you ask too much of the states. The states ask too much of the federal government anyway. That's his whole philosophy. So I've been opposed to this guy from the beginning. And you know what? It's terrible. So and that isn't even in the news because of what's going on with the Supreme Court, which of course is dominating everything.
What a weird philosophy. I think people who are struck by disasters should be responsible for recovering from disasters.
Yeah, you do what you need to do first, and we're a last resort. Otherwise, you have to pay money. It's too expensive. It's federalism.
Yeah, I don't really get where that comes from in disaster.
What do you want to do? Raise taxes so that make the federal government responsible? That's how welfare happens.
Mm-hmm. I guess so. All right.
It's all part of the same world.
Have a taste of it, North Carolina. You asked for it. You got it. No problem. All right. Well, we'll
anyway. So this bombshell that it's more than a bombshell. It's a nuclear explosion that nobody expected. Happens yesterday when the accuser of Brett Kavanaugh actually puts her name to a article in the Washington Post, and all hell breaks loose.
Wow.
And let's talk a little bit about that. Axios has a pretty good summary about what's going on. They have good sources in the White House. Scoop: GOP plans to play hardball on Kavanaugh, which makes so much more sense than the dumb Abby Phillip tweet that I saw this morning. Kellyanne Conway moments ago on Kavanaugh's accuser. This woman should not be insulted and she should not be ignored. She says she should be heard as well as Kavanaugh, and then further tweeted something along the lines of the White House is torn. They don't want to go too hard because they know that Collins and Murkowski will consider that, which is, of course, ridiculous because, as I just mentioned, what they really want to do is play hardball. And Sam Stein had a very interesting tweet from Axios. I can't find the source. It must have been their newsletter. The GOP counterattack on Kavanaugh's accuser is outlined this morning to Axios, already not playing out as planned. Some involved, he says, in the Axios, he has a screenshot of this. Some involved in the process are going to urge Senate leaders to call on the accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, that's Dr. Ford, who went on the record with the Washington Post's Emma Brown to testify publicly this week ahead of Thursday's scheduled Judiciary Committee. This gambit basically bets that she will decline, and Republicans can then say they tried to investigate further. Well, the problem is she's already agreed. She did that this morning. So she's ready to testify, and now the question is, what do you do? Because the way that Grassley wanted to do this is to get her to testify tomorrow and then vote on Thursday. And that's not really enough time to prepare for a Senate hearing. It's going to be a circus.
As if you don't care.
So the problem for Grassley, and by the way, just as a sidelight, my understanding is that Grassley and Orrin Hatch on the Republican side, Feinstein and Leahy on the Democratic side are actually old enough to have been at the Thomas Hill hearings, Thomas Anita Hill.
Yeah, I gather that they were.
And so they know what this is going to turn into. And the problem for Grassley, who is the chair, and as we've talked about on the show many times, and as you have taught me, he has the gavel, therefore he makes all the rules, and if they aren't the rules, he'll make them the rules and then ratify it with the majority. But the problem for Grassley is that you got people on his own side like Jeff Flake, who's on the committee, and Bob Corker, who's not, but whose vote is going to be needed to confirm, both saying that no, don't, and Murkowski,
Right.
saying, no, you need to let her testify. I can't vote yes if you don't let her testify.
Yeah.
Collins, of course, is troubled, but hasn't committed one way or the other.
Yes. Well, yeah, I see this morning she's already, hot garbage at this point.
Yeah, she was surprised by the accusation, but doesn't know enough to create the judgment at this point. And besides, she spoke to him on Friday, and he denied it.
Well, like Vladimir Putin, the denial is everything. This morning I read that she's actually attacking Democrats over their handling of the allegation, which is incredible given Republican handling of the allegation, but okay.
Look, I mean, people who are complaining about the timing are complaining about the allegation, not the timing.
Yes.
It's just a dodge.
Right. Well, she can't be seen complaining about the allegation because she represents women. Okay,
Yeah, so,
sure, whatever.
It's a dumpster fire because it's only going to get worse. So now you're going to have the prospect of all-male GOP Senate Judiciary Committee, likely televised hearings, grilling a victim. And then you got an election in 50 days.
Awesome.
My friend, they could lose the Senate over this.
Well, let them do it. I mean,
yeah, but the thing is, so now you have the really interesting piece here.
Yes.
GOP wants to play hardball, but the Senate is a separate institution, or so the Constitution claims. And you now have Donald Trump's interests, which is never backing down and never, absolutely ever backing down about sexual allegations.
Right.
Contrasting with Mitch McConnell, who wants to remain majority leader.
Oh, well.
So Trump may not want this pulled, and McConnell may want this pulled.
Yeah.
Well, and if that's how it turns out, McConnell will pull it.
It's going to be interesting.
One thing about being a ruthless reptile with cold eyes is you'll pull this.
Yeah.
If you think it's not in your interest.
I think, I think that's a pretty good prediction. And my guess is, if we have to guess now, whether Trump, after it gets pulled, says outrageous, McConnell, insider, institutionalist, drain the swamp, or whether he says that's what I agree, or quietly lets it go, or what. I'm not certain how he's going to play it. I think he slinks away. I think he just lets McConnell do what he wants to do.
So here's from the Hardball article from Axios. It's really interesting. That's the one that went ahead and said, I found the link here, that the gambit was basically betting that she'll decline to testify, and that's already failed. So, other quotes from that piece. A source close to the process says that if Democrats sink Kavanaugh, we'll just bring in someone more conservative. I don't know that there is anybody more conservative. This guy is a hard-right political operative. It's essentially like true. Karl Rove in robes.
Yeah, I mean, he, as it happens,
that's his background.
He went to
that's
law
what
school.
He used to do. So the idea that he's going to be more is ridiculous. But you also have a scenario where how are you going to get that done in time for the election?
Yeah.
And if this costs Republicans the election, how are you going to go ahead and turn around and bring in somebody more conservative?
Yeah,
that's why they're worried. And the article goes on to say there's extreme queasiness in the Kavanaugh camp last night. Ford, a professor at Palo Alto University, is represented by Deborah Katz, a Washington lawyer specializing in sexual harassment cases. Republicans won't be surprised if Ford holds a press conference or gives a TV interview, which would raise the stakes considerably. The initial news coverage was brutal. The New York Times thrown into uncertainty, Washington Post nomination in doubt, Wall Street Journal injecting immediate uncertainty, Associated Press thrust into turmoil. What I did is at the top of my pundit roundup, I just made a picture of Trump standing in front of a dumpster fire, because that's pretty much what it is.
It's pretty much a disaster for them,
right?
Thank God.
So Republicans got more worried as the evening went along, but privately were optimistic about winning the PR fight. That's because it's a bunch of men talking to other men about how men are going to rally behind this.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they said publicly. And you can't imagine how stupid it is. The whole thing about this blue wave is that it's dominated and driven and powered by women.
Yes.
And so they're stupid. I don't know how else to say it.
No. There is no other way to say it. They're just stupid and complacent, and it's always worked before, so they're going to try it again. Kellyanne Conway, no one's friend in this, by the way. I assume, I mean, I can see that she understands that this is going to be a political disaster for them, and she's trying to extricate them from it. But if you talk to her long enough about the subject, she will just say, well, I mean, I think that they should hear her out and then declare her to be a liar.
Yeah, exactly. They should allow the hearing to take place this afternoon in about 15 minutes, and if she's not there, oh well, we tried. Let's have the vote on Thursday, or some equivalent, which is not that different.
Yeah. So
that was their plan, and so fine, but that's not going to work because she's willing to do that, and there's other prospects going on of getting worse news because the more this sinks in, now you've got a whole bunch of people who are going to be contacting their senators, talking about, unfortunately, their own, issues that took place to them. Women who are going to come out and say, "Me too." Oh, by the way, that's the year of Me Too. This is this whole thing here going on. And in that environment, in that background, this is not Thomas Hill. This is not 1991. This is not 1970. And so to do it this year, and by the way, at the same time, separately, and it's got nothing to do with this, but it is part of the background that ordinary people make up their mind about such things. The Catholic Church is being roiled by accusations of cover-up.
Yeah.
And so you can't just say, okay, sweep it under the rug. Let's just go ahead and move this and railroad this through. It's not going to work. Grassley thinks it is. Grassley's an idiot.
Well, yeah. These guys haven't, paid attention to this kind of development, this kind of news in years.
Right, and so further,
away with it.
You could even see this play out on Twitter. You got conservatives who immediately took the approach of, well, wait a minute, but then said, okay, this isn't it. You got to admit this is an issue. And you've got other conservatives who basically say, look, this is ridiculous. Go ahead and take that vote. And devolving rather quickly to the, look, we won, too bad for you, let's just do it. Yeah. My point being that it all devolves to the GOP down to raw power now, without even the pretense of being fair. Bring up Merrick Garland if you want to talk about fairness, because that's part of the background too. Bring about Collins and Murkowski saying what Al Franken did was terrible, proven or not, he has to step down. Yeah. That's part of the background too. And so, no, this is all about, look, we have the votes and we're going to push this through, and it's about power. And if we don't do this, how are we supposed to justify everything that we've done in order to get control of the Supreme Court? That was the whole point. Yeah. We've been trying this for 40 years. You can't take that away from us at the last minute.
Yeah, well, that's what I guess it all comes down to that. There's whatever they're.
It's just so ugly when it's all out in the open. Yeah, now. But it's out in the open now.
Right. Well, but it's been there, but in a slightly different context. All the other terrible things that they were willing to tolerate, and babies in cages, tax cuts. That's what the trade was, and now, your daughters were sexually assaulted in school by this guy. Well, point is we're going to win some cases now.
The if you want to see the open, bleeding, wounded id of the GOP, on this issue, there's probably no better place to look than Hugh Hewitt, who basically sold his soul in order to get this Supreme Court nominee. And his opinion, of course, is, well, the best thing to do in this mess is confirm him as quickly as possible, then let the voters vote on that judgment in November.
Yes, I saw that referred to, I think, quite correctly and cleverly as the reverse Garland.
Exactly. And so, no, that's not going to work either. But that's what it's always been about. And so what happens now? This guy is really not a good person. And one of the things about being a justice on the Supreme Court is you get the final say on what's good and what's bad.
Yeah.
What's legal and what's not legal. And to have somebody this tainted on the Supreme Court not only taints the justice, but also taints the entire court. It is such a stupid thing to continue to push this. They've got Hardiman. They've got other people they could have pushed instead. And Mitch McConnell told them that. Well, of the people who were the finalists, this would be the most difficult.
Yeah, well,
And they said, good, let's do that.
Yeah, I guess so. Losing a Supreme Court seat to own the libs. So, good job. Well, we'll see whether they're able to try and recover. It'll be amazing if they pull the thing. And in terms of what's going to be hilarious is they're going to want to make a mad dash for confirmation of the next person. And, I mean, we just saw this happen largely. Right. I mean, it developed the way it did.
Because you went too fast.
You went too fast. Yeah, so let's go even faster. Okay, this is... All right, well, luckily it's almost time to vote.
Well, the break's coming up, but let me just say before we're done with this segment...
I'm not taking any break.
Is that there are certain things, be it baby jails or the Mueller investigation, which is still very active given that Paul Manafort has flipped, and hurricane disaster response. Some stories stay in the news. They stick there. They're more than 24-hour news cycle where you can distract and do something else. And this is going to be one of those stories. And it's not going to be to the benefit of the Republican Party, who are already in trouble in this coming election. This is bad news for them.
I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with it, but I'm just saying.
Yeah.
The smarter people in the party are going to start saying, you know what, pull his nomination.
Yeah. Well, I imagine they're clamoring for it already. It's got to be pretty uncomfortable.
And I'm telling you now, the White House won't agree, but McConnell may do it for him and save them.
All right. Well, I would accept that as well, although I don't really want to credit Mitch McConnell with anything. But I think it sounds like he was clear on one thing. This would be a troublesome nomination, although he must have been surprised for a while. He probably thought it was smooth sailing so far, and we might actually get to this thing and get it done before anybody finds out why I thought he was such a bad nominee. Interesting. All right,
Mitch is a good vote counter.
He's got that. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Greg Dworkin still with us, rounding up, a hell of a weekend. So, I don't know. I think we could probably spend the whole day complaining about Brett Kavanaugh, and that wouldn't be wrong to do that. But, I think we've hit just about everything, although I will point out a lot of Kavanaugh takes not aging very well, that's for sure, and things that came in over the week prior to these allegations coming to light are beginning to look a little silly, like the Washington Post piece, I think it was, claiming, hey, I don't know anything about him as a judge, but he's a great carpool dad. That's a good one. And then, of course, the idea of bringing the girls' basketball team to back him up at the hearing is looking a little weird. Definitely did see somebody tweeting today, hey, maybe I wonder whether there's going to be some parents reconsidering, saying, I mean, if nothing else, I don't think Brett Kavanaugh should be coaching a girls' basketball team.
So here's the thing, which now if you want to step back and be a little bit of conspiracy theory, because there's no evidence for this.
I'm for that.
So 65 women immediately sprung to Kavanaugh's defense and said, no, he's a great guy from high school. And it was organized in less than 24 hours.
Yes.
And then they started presenting how he coaches the girls' basketball team and all of the ads that have been playing on TV, which have been bought and paid for and put on TV for some time prior to this, generally feature women talking about what a great guy Brett Kavanaugh is. He's awesome. So you step back and say, well, what did Grassley and the Republicans know about Brett Kavanaugh that made them concentrate on doing women-friendly PR for him?
Yes.
To try to soften his view or view of him in order to get him nominated. He's still one of the most unpopular nominations ever, according to the polling. He's like Harriet Miers territory. And Doug Jones is an interesting point to bring up about this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, Jones said before all of this happened, I'm sort of inclined to vote for him, but I have to tell you, he's not that popular even here in Alabama.
They know judges.
And that's the thing. The other thing is Doug Jones won a special election over another Republican accused of sexual harassment, Roy Moore.
That guy, yes.
Okay. And so because Doug Jones won, I think Doug Jones is on the Judiciary Committee.
Yeah.
So that means that was an extra vote on the Judiciary Committee that the Republicans would have to overcome. And right now it's an 11-10 committee.
Yeah.
The karma is, of course, that's because of Doug Jones, and it's because his opponent was accused of sexual harassment. Now, so you have this difficult thing happening with Brett Kavanaugh, and you're the process guy. What does the committee do? What are their choices? I mean, they can vote to send to the Senate with a recommendation to approve.
Yes.
They can report him unfavorably out of committee.
Right.
They can take no action and still send it to the floor. Or they can bottle it up in committee, which isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
But they can do any of those things, right?
Yes, they can. They could also do nothing. I mean, they can just sit there and say, we don't know what to do. And
so my point is that if Flake, who's already said, I'm on the committee and I can't vote on this unless I get more information.
Yeah, whatever
his
that means.
Unwillingness to vote yes doesn't mean that therefore the nomination fails, is what I'm trying to say. There's different ways the committee can send it to the floor anyway.
Yes, there are. And then there are ways it can be taken from out of the committee's hands as well, although it would be pretty unusual.
Well, this is a whole unusual circumstance.
Yes, that's true.
John
You're right.
Pastelik, who is a political scientist, points out that back in the day, Robert Bork was defeated in committee 9-5, but he still got a floor vote.
Yes.
And more recently, Clarence Thomas was deadlocked 7-7 in committee, and then that was sent to the floor, and he won confirmation.
Yeah. By the way, put that in your Borking file. He actually lost the committee vote, but they said, well, let's have a vote on the floor anyway. Oh, and then he lost that one too. But he was, cheated somehow.
He was borked. He was borked twice. It means being defeated 2 times in a row, I guess.
Right.
That's what
a lot of
being
people
borked
have
means.
that problem.
So the point I'm making is that, again, this is a whole process thing where you simply can't rely on somebody like Jeff Flake saying, okay, well, maybe I'll even vote. No, that doesn't necessarily stop the nomination.
No,
but,
not by itself.
But with such a closely divided Senate, plus with an election less than 2 months away, he also gets the vote on the floor.
Yeah.
It would be weird for him to say no in committee and then yes on the floor, although that can happen too.
Oh, yeah, anything can happen. That's true.
So I'm just making the point that he can't stand there athwart history and say no with a simple, I'm not going to do it. It's actually more technical than that.
Yeah.
He would need support from other people, and then the committee itself doesn't have the final word. I'm just reminding people of that.
Yeah. All right.
However, it's messy and ugly if you do it that way, and it would be really, really bad politics.
It would be. I don't know if the president knows anything about politics, but...
No, but again, that's why I'm saying this is McConnell stuff. This isn't Trump stuff.
Yeah,
we know what Trump's going to do. It's almost immaterial. What matters a whole lot more is what does McConnell want to do.
We will find out shortly, I think. By the way, I do have, let's see, one, I had some questions put to us from the audience, and also some, I don't know, I guess would this be breaking news? Well, there's first, let's see. Michael Musson was noting that if the typical pattern holds, there will be other women perhaps coming out and saying, hey, did that to me too, but I was afraid to say anything until now. And that is truly a typical pattern on both sides of the ball, if you for lack of a better term there. It turns out usually that somebody who does this once, it's rarely a thing like, oh, I'll try some sexual assault, see how it goes. It sometimes proves to be part of a pattern, but when it is, then you begin to hear from other people. And I think That's true. That is part of a repetitive pattern. We also had a question that I think a lot of people had during the weekend, and there was some answer for it in the news about, well, how to... Everybody immediately, I think, thought, well, where do they get 65 women who say they knew him in high school? It's been 35 years since he graduated from high school. P.S., most people noticed right away, Georgetown Prep is an all-boys school. None of the 65 women who signed the letter went to high school with him. That did not happen. But the claim immediately was, well, he just, from the neighborhood. Whatever. And, in these circles, the elite prep school circles, there's a sister school. They have mixers all the time. And they do interact. And, kids are still kids. They know kids who don't go to school with them. But the idea of getting 65 of them right away, how did that happen? And a lot of questions in terms of, did the Republicans know this was coming? And did they prepare this letter ahead of time? The claim still is, no. I'm a friend of his, and another friend of his, and a friend of mine contacted me and said, would you sign this letter about how awesome Brett Kavanaugh is? And we did it. Like I said, it's a country club sexual assault phone tree that they have, I guess, at the ready. And in certain circles, you can find 65 muffies and whatever, biffies and
this is one of those
missies.
break glass in case of sexual assault.
Maybe, I guess.
And inside the glass is a phone, and you pick up the phone and you start talking to people. This is crazy.
Circulate an email. You've seen those forward. Help.
I can understand a lot of people signing, not really understanding what they're signing. I can see a lot of people say,
yes.
But you know what? If you're going to interview Dr. Ford, and by the way, you should bring Kavanaugh back and put him under oath. Yeah, why don't you bring the 65 women and talk to them under oath?
That's something that they could do. Well, that would take too long, you see. But of course, somebody
you have to delay the hearing, but bring some of them in under oath. Let's talk about how this happened.
Well, now we have a problem because it's not going to work. Daniel Lippman, Politico reporter, tweets that he and his coworker, his compatriot Andrew Restuccia, also at Politico, had the unique idea of finding and calling the 65 women. And they're all, by the way, they all still pretty much live here in the Maryland, D.C. area. Well, you remember, Brett Kavanaugh grew up in a city plagued by crime, Bethesda.
Yeah.
I would say this. I looked at the letter myself and I said, well, who are these people? I was just sort of curious. Like, if they all turn out to be Republican National Committee members, your eyebrows would jump off of your head or whatever. And,
Where's Selena Zito when we need her?
Right. But they are all, mostly, they're all still here. I just sort of found it interesting that, like, in this current, in our modern world today, such a mobile society, people are moving all the time for jobs and all sorts of things, and just finding better housing markets, whatever. This is a very particular kind of private school, prep school, country club set. They don't move much. They're living in their parents' houses, largely, compounds, what have you. But they're all still here. So to find 65 people who knew you in high school who are still here in Bethesda, I thought was pretty remarkable. Anyway, so that means that they were also pretty easy to reach for the most part. Daniel Lippman and Andrew Restuccia now saying, we called as many of Kavanaugh's 65 female high school acquaintances who signed a letter supporting him as they could. And after his accuser came out on Sunday, they could find only 2 who would go on record and say, yeah, I still think so. I still will stand by him. More than 24 didn't respond. 2 declined to comment. They couldn't get anybody to get back on the record all of a sudden. They either hadn't practiced this play, or they suddenly realized, I really don't know anything about Brett Kavanaugh. I know who he is. I met him at a party. I heard he was nominated to the Supreme Court. I thought that was cool. Whatever. And that was that. Or they're like, now that you mention it, it is possible, entirely possible. This is part of our problem here, is that some large number of these women grew up thinking exactly that, positive thing. Brett Kavanaugh, he was just like everybody else. And then thinking back, having now had this incident recalled to them and saying, he was okay. I mean, I thought in the 80s, but I'm now reevaluating what happened in the 80s and earlier. And things that I thought were okay, or just the kind of thing that happens at prep school parties, really weren't okay at all. I'm curious about how this develops.
Yeah, well, that's why under oath would be nice, but also maybe bring under oath his character witness, the other boy that was there.
Oh my God, he won't swear to anything.
Well, he was blackout drunk. He wrote books about being blackout drunk at the time, and your books of that era have surfaced. Let's just say a bit misogynist in terms of the content. So I don't know how good a character witness that guy would be. I'll tell you how it's playing, though. Rachel Bade from Politico, Congress reporter, political analyst, says Kavanaugh's confirmation was supposed to be a central plank for Senate Republicans' bid to keep the majority. But even if the Republicans get him confirmed, it will be tough to spin this as a victory. These toxic allegations will drive out the Democratic base, not to mention women already furious with Trump. That's an observation from this morning, which is just spot on true, part of what I was talking about as well. This is a toxic, tainted nominee. There is no way that you go back to the way it was. It's done. It's over.
Yeah, it's going to be really problematic.
Anybody with half a brain would say, let's pull him and do somebody else who doesn't have this kind of baggage.
Yeah. And by the way, who's looking super prophetic in all of this is Mazie Hirono.
Yep.
I'm just asking everybody. I mean, she is. It's not prophecy. It's just being realistic. Everybody's going to have something to answer for. Look, were you alive in society at this time? Yes. Did you do any of this? No. Well, what do you think of it then?
Right. Let me read Daniel Lippman's tweet.
All right.
Because I think it puts the finger on what you were saying. Andrew Restuccia and I called many of Kavanaugh's 65 female high school acquaintances who signed a letter supporting him. After his accuser came out, only 2 said they still stood by him.
Yes.
2 declined to comment. More than 24 didn't respond. So Ryan Grimm points out, from 65, Kavanaugh down to 2.
Yeah.
I'm sure he can creep that number up, but that's revealing in and of itself. This is just playing so badly.
Yeah.
I don't know how you pull people out of their, hey, who is it, Ed Rollins, who runs a pro-Trump super PAC and a longtime Republican operative, said something along the lines of, you can't let accusations like this stand. That would taint everybody, all the men.
Though there were plenty of people with that line. Oh, my God. Those were bad tweets,
yes,
fellows.
Probably all the men in the White House. But the underlying point, I guess he was trying to get at but didn't want to say, is that would point back to Trump.
Yes.
Because don't forget, we have somebody accused of way more than that.
Right.
Who happens to be president of the United States right now.
That's the big
problem. And part of Trump's defense of Kavanaugh is going to be a defense of himself, which is one of the reasons why this is going to be so messy.
Yes.
And why it's so stupid for Republicans to do this.
I can't figure it out. There are a lot of people, though. Yeah, yesterday the big thing to say among Republican men was either, oh, come on, everybody's done this, which was like, oh, my God, what are you, crazy? And then, of course, the slippery slope argument. Well, if we're going back to high school, then, again, don't keep talking. As your attorney, I would say, please, that's enough testimony from you right now. Right. And the slippery slope, as it turns out to be, is, well, if you have to examine people's record on sexual assault, you're going to have to examine everybody's, including there's this one guy who's sort of behind all of this, who we all know all these things about. And, why didn't those women come forward? Why didn't they just all go on Access Hollywood and tell right away? We don't know. I hope it doesn't spread to him. It's been amazing. Look, I hope this plays out longer. I could go for another round. It was losing. It seemed like it wasn't like Me Too was disappearing, but it was certainly, from a news cycle standpoint, losing steam. And there were some dings put in the whole narrative in the last couple of weeks. I'm for another round. I'm okay with that. If it keeps Brett Kavanaugh off the court, that's great too. But the only thing to fear now is the hot takes of too clever by half Democratic legal circle defenders of Brett Kavanaugh saying, well, you're just going to get someone worse. Hit me with it. Let's bring it on.
Well,
no problem. Don't worry about it.
The former president of the United States on Twitter, Richard M. Nixon, the account that plays that, who's actually very funny and often very insightful, says, at least we can laugh, I suppose, at Kavanaugh's friend, the drunk, attempting to conceal him in his memoir as Bart O'Kavanaugh.
Yes, I love that one. I was looking for a way to sneak that in. I'm glad it was, I'm glad Dick Nixon.
Thank you, Mr. President, for pointing that out to us.
Who is that? Yeah, it's pretty grim. And his friend really, he tells the story. And lots of what's come out on Kavanaugh himself, just his stupid emails to his friends. We keep saying, or rather, it keeps being said by Republicans, you're going all the way back to 35 years ago in high school, and people do dumb things in high school. A lot of his official emails, like in the White House, are emails to his buds, where he's a bro, like well into his 40s, and constantly arranging, guys' weekends away and describing them in rather lurid terms and talking about who knows whether he's being serious or not, but certainly about the drinking and the gambling, et cetera, and wow.
Business as usual. Well, yeah. Again, one look at politics again before I go and give you your show back. A new West Virginia poll from Emerson shows Joe Manchin up by 12, 45-33 over Morrissey.
Okay.
And in West Virginia 3, Ojeda for Congress, Democrat 36, Carol Miller, Republican 31, undecided 33 in that House vote. But this is West by God, Virginia.
Yes.
And the point I'm making here is that Manchin can vote no on this.
Yeah.
And as of today, so can Heidi Heitkamp, and so can Joe Donnelly. They have plenty of reason and material to vote no. If they were wavering or, again, you don't put pressure on the red state Democrats until the last minute to see what the lay of the land is. This is one of the reasons why. Now, if they vote no, it's because they reasoned and thoughtfully considered all of the information before they make their vote. At least that's what they're going to tell their constituents.
That's hilarious. But
Isn't
so
it?
True.
But this is one of the reasons why you don't push them to vote too early.
All right. Okay. Or,
because otherwise their opponents would say, you already made up their mind. This has nothing to do with it. Now they can say, no, I told you I wasn't making my mind up yet, and this decided it, and this is fair to decide on stuff like this.
Yes, I guess that's true. Although, again, you could, if you don't answer all the way up, then you can say, well, you know what it was? It was his decision in Jones v. Smith that really changed my mind. If you don't want to put this, if for some reason you think you won't get away with this one.
But you can also say I had time to consider and actually go back and read Jones v. Smith, which I really wasn't that familiar with until, you just asked me about it.
Right.
So, the Democrats, I think, are in pretty good shape in terms of deciding not to vote for this guy. The Republicans are under tremendous pressure. We make fun of Susan Collins, and for good reason. But she has to be feeling the heat like nobody's business. I mean, that's why she keeps saying, well, I'm complaining about the timing. I don't like the way the Democrats did this, that, and everything. She is feeling the heat. She knows everybody's staring at her.
Yeah. Well, good for her. She's done a terrific job. I don't want to say anything bad about Suzanne O'Collins. But she's a terrible senator and an idiot, and I hope this is her last term, and she suffers greatly in her defeat.
Suzanne O'Collins, McMaster, McBean, right?
The Bart O'Kavanaugh.
It's pretty funny.
He's
anyway,
a writer.
I'm going to leave you with that. But yeah, this is a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
Hence the picture that I made at the top of the pundit roundup today.
Ta-da.
And Trump, of course, is reveling in it because he dances around fires.
Oh, I love chaos.
While the rest of it's not just the White House trying to contain him now. Now it's going to be the Senate. And ain't that interesting? Take care, and it's good to be back, and I'll talk to you on Wednesday.
All righty. Well, let's keep the ball rolling here. Thanks very much, Greg. And what an incredible day. I think we spent the whole morning on Kavanaugh, and I don't see how we could have done anything else. Thanks for your help. Okay. And that's it. No more Kavanaugh. The end. I am certain that we will probably continue on that. And I'm just sort of now I'm combing through other sources that I've got and other stories that have come up. But I mean, I'm absolutely completely preoccupied with that story. I am very curious to see how it will play out. Not so much on the substance of the story, although it will be very fascinating if they actually bring his accuser to testify in front of Congress. And I guess we're now at the stage where we want to publicize the name of the accuser now that it's all out, I guess, and we don't want to. Why simply label her as the accuser? She's considerably more than just his accuser. Christine, is it Blasey Ford? I was curious to know how many of the 65 women on this letter may have known her. But I didn't really want to ask that question. I don't think that's entirely fair. And I don't know how much we would learn from that, because one of the things, if you think back on what sort of atmosphere they were operating in during the time that this incident allegedly took place, it would not be uncommon at all to find that Christine, and I guess is the fact that she's got the three names here. Was she Christine Blasey at the time and is now married and is Christine Blasey Ford, or I don't know, maybe that was always her name. Like I said, it's a country club prep school set. They have names like that. And so I'm not really certain what her what that background issue is. But I guess I would not be surprised if, had she alleged such a thing had happened at the time or not. Essentially, I wouldn't be surprised if, upon being seen perhaps exiting the room where this allegedly took place, that's all that it takes. Some significant portion of the 65 women who signed this letter may very well have been at that party, and seeing her emerge from the room with, or immediately followed, I guess, by Brett Kavanaugh and his friend. And the guy's name, Mark Judge? I think Judge. How ironic. Leaving the room afterwards. Probably a lot of whispers. And probably a lot of discussion. And it may very well be the case that these 65 women went on to spend the rest of their 35 years since thinking that Christine Blasey Ford was asking for it, in on it, wanted to be there, or was just a drunken idiot who ended up there because she was young and stupid. And I don't know. I'm not so sure that asking the women on the letter would be helpful in getting an accurate picture of what they might remember about her. But this has been a very interesting weekend for more revelation and discussion about just how prevalent sexual assault really always has been. It really has been a great opportunity to think about what we've set up for ourselves without necessarily even getting into the detail, because we don't know it yet, about what happened. Although maybe we'll get more detail and very shortly hear more about it. But let's see, I was reminded this week, making offhand comments, like just thinking about the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, and the fact, of course, that he made it all the way to the Supreme Court regardless. And yes, there was a lot of discussion among a lot of people this weekend about how do you even justify it at this point? Like, what would be the message to the women, and particularly the women voters in this country, to have gone through the trauma of the Anita Hill accusations against Clarence Thomas, and then the confirmation of Clarence Thomas to top that all off, and then come back so many years later and essentially display for the women of America that nothing has changed. Nothing has been learned here. We just did the same thing all over again. I mean, you want to see you thought there was an explosion of women candidates and consciousness for all of us of what women have gone through and are still going through in this country. I can't imagine how that would fuel things. I'm talking about throwing gasoline on the fire, or I guess more technically, near a fire such that the vapors would catch flame. I don't want any chemists calling in and complaining. Anyway, I mean, it would be fine. I would love to talk to chemists. I'm sure it would be a great show. I'm sorry, chemists. I don't mean to say this, but this has been really interesting. And I was thinking about, for instance, the fact that, well, geez, if you imagine how you have Kavanaugh and Thomas on the court at the same time, it's like, well, we already have a, sexual assault seat. It's filled. We never really discussed the necessity for two of them. And just thinking to myself, like, wow, this would be the rapiest Supreme Court ever. And then having, of course, it dawn on me, like, well, I don't actually know that that's the case. Maybe that's an irresponsible statement. I bet there were rapier Supreme Courts. Like, for instance, the fact that used to be the case that they were all men, and that probably only increased the odds. But more to the point, I guess I was thinking more along the lines of, well, how about back in the days when it was all men and it was some significant portion populated by slaveholders? I imagine that Supreme Court was probably rapier. We just, quote unquote, didn't know it at the time. But we knew it. We just didn't care about it. That was either not discussed or just outright okay, at least in certain circles. And in all likelihood, even after those days, there are probably a number of distinguished jurists who served with distinction and are widely recalled as among the best, who may very well have had similar circumstances in their background. And it was certainly a poor look for Republicans to spend the weekend saying, come on, we've all done it. I believe you have all done it. I know. I want to put a stop to it, and so does the rest of us. Wow. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. I am just watching the traffic go by, and there's an awful lot to it here. I don't know. I think we're going to stay on this topic for quite some time. There's so many amazing aspects to it here. Let's see. I'm trying to recall who tweeted this idea. But I have a couple more notes from Greg in the background. Let me see. I'm trying to find this tweet I was reminded of. I'll see if I can look it up along the way here. But Greg has sent me a couple more notes. Mark Murray's tweet, NBC News, Mark Murray, tweeting, remember when 2 months ago Mitch McConnell was telling the Trump White House that Raymond Kethledge and Thomas Hardiman would be much easier to confirm than Kavanaugh? And a link to a New York Times article to that effect, a little screen grab here that he included here, saying Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, told President Trump this past week that judges Raymond M. Kethledge and Thomas M. Hardiman, well, the M brothers there, presented the fewest obvious obstacles to being confirmed to replace Kennedy on the Supreme Court, according to Republican officials briefed on the conversation. While careful not to directly make the case for any would-be justice, Mr. McConnell made it clear in multiple phone calls with Mr. Trump and the White House counsel, Donald F. McGahn II, in case you were wondering, that the lengthy paper trail of another top contender, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, would pose difficulties for his confirmation. That brings up another point, of course. Interesting. The lengthy paper trail would pose difficulties for his confirmation. When was this? This was in an article from July. Looks like July 7th, according to the URL here. I didn't click through all the way. But so back in early July, saying the lengthy paper trail is going to be a problem. And then, what do you know? We're not going to show you that paper trail. So that, by the way, reminds me of, the way this whole thing actually sets up. I don't know that this is the way anyone would characterize this necessarily. But what ended up happening here, to the outside observer, is Democrats confronted with Kavanaugh. They know he has this paper trail. They ask for the paper trail. Let me see this guy's paper trail. What's in his papers? And Republicans say, we're not going to show you. We are not going to allow you to see his papers. Well, reply the Democrats at this point. We just found out that he was accused of rape at some point in the past, or at least of attempted rape in the past. So, I mean, what else are you hiding in those papers? I mean, you were prepared with this letter and 65 women signing this thing almost overnight, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like you knew about this. And maybe you knew about this because you've got his paper trail and we don't. So now that we know that he's been accused, at this point, sounds pretty credibly, right? Accused of attempted rape. What else is in there? Well, we're still not going to show you. And we still demand on an immediate vote. And even if we have to withdraw this guy's nomination, we're going to insist on doing this whole thing over again with the next nominee, and also not showing you anything, and also not giving you any time to consider him. Well, a lot of things grew out of that, including, well, let's see. I thought of like 15 things along the way here. But yeah, I guess one thing that came up in the tweet I was looking for was when this news clip from the New York Times brought up Don McGahn. And somebody made the observation, and I wasn't able to find the tweet, saying, yeah, who was it, by the way, who knew that, what was his position? Staff secretary? Was that it? Rob Porter had a serious problem, was domestic abuse and sexual assault problem. And who knew that he had it, and who worked so hard to keep it quiet until they could finally hide it no longer, and he ended up having to be dismissed? Don McGahn was your man on that play, who very likely then also knew about Brett Kavanaugh's background and has been playing hard to cover that up until it exploded in the news and blew up in his face. And the answer there, I guess, according to the tweet anyway, is Don McGahn also. Now, McGahn would more obviously be responsible for a judicial nomination like Kavanaugh's. I don't know how responsible he is for Porter, but I guess looking back on the story, any of you remember clearly Don McGahn having a prominent role in deciding how to play the Rob Porter story? Doesn't come immediately to mind for me, but I think it's entirely possible that he may in fact have done that. Let's see. Meanwhile, this along the way, I've lost track of about 15 of the 20 things that I also said, oh, this reminds me, there's another angle in this story. And can't really recall what it is now. But I'll scroll through my notes here via the Twitter timeline. I know a lot of them have been spit out before and maybe deserve some revisiting. One of the things I took note of here. Oh, yes, and by the way, it was our Twitter friend Grudging One who fed me that line via Twitter last night about holding SCOTUS nominees accountable for sexual assault is a slippery slope to doing the same for presidents. Well put. Also, Josh Barrow, who I find less and less interested in retweeting these days, certainly hit the nail on the head with this one. He's retweeting Noah Shachtman's tweet. Noah Shachtman, editor-in-chief, apparently, of the Daily Beast, tweeting, the president has told those close to him in recent days that he believes there is a, quote, conspiracy or organized effort by Democrats to smear Kavanaugh and try to derail the nomination of a good man. And Josh Barrow noting this would be a more convincing argument, if he didn't also say it about Rob Porter and Roy Moore and Paul Manafort and Mike Tyson, just to really bring the point home. Very, well stated. That is true. Oh, and that reminds me along the way, thinking about the letter, the 65 women on the letter, and the rather incredible, but I guess theoretically possible tale that says that all of the women were in fact contacted after the allegations came to light, and they all just jumped at the opportunity to get on such a letter, and it's just an amazing organizing feat, essentially. And aren't we lucky that they're all still here in the suburban Maryland area so that we can easily reach them and organize them for such an effort. Very difficult to believe, but I guess it's possible, and they're out there swearing up and down that that is actually the way it went. They contacted me just the other day, and I said absolutely, and I jumped on the letter. I said a couple of the women. And I just want to point out, for instance, I'm sure that there is some pushback out there on the Daniel Lippman, Andrew Restuccia effort to reach these 65 women and say, so, given what has happened over the weekend, do you still stand by Kavanaugh as a great guy? And only the two of them said that they would. I'd love to see which two, of course. Some people were pointing out there are a few, not necessarily suspect names, but they're definitely, like, I think Britt Hume's daughter, for one reason or another, is on that list. I thought that was interesting. Britt Hume, by the way, not covering himself in glory either over the weekend, tweeting something along the lines of, oh boy, here we go, Anita Hill all over again. And amazingly, and that he would say such a thing, and quite correctly pointed out to him almost immediately, you say that as though there weren't millions of people out in the country for whom Anita Hill was right all along and a hero even then. And it's rather amazing that you would say it like that. Oh, here we go. The same story all over again about another Republican judge being nominated for the Supreme Court who was actually, it turns out, a total scumbag to a lot of women, and they came out and said so, and you ignored them. Well, all right, if that's the way you want to play it. Although I will also note, for the record, that I'm curious how this plays over at, Joe Biden for president headquarters, if there is one. Of course, he's flirting with the idea of running for president. He did not perform fantastically, let us say, in the Anita Hill hearings. And I wonder how many people will remember that. And that might be a good reason for him to start thinking about what he wants to say about the Kavanaugh situation. And it might not be a bad idea. I don't know whether this political consultants would ever consider such a thing, but it might not be a bad idea to say, well, I'm one person anyway who learned a great deal from the Anita Hill hearings. I look back on that with great regret, and I would handle it very differently if I were on the Judiciary Committee today. That might be wise. I don't know if it would be wise for positioning yourself for a run for the presidency or not, but I think it would be wise just as a personal note. Anyway, I was wondering whether anyone was out there from the other side here attacking Lippman and Restuccia's effort and saying, if you read this carefully, right, it's one thing to say, well, we called many of his Kavanaugh's 65 female high school acquaintances who signed this letter, and only 2 said they stood by him. And you say, wow, oh my God, 63 of them changed their mind. That's not the case just yet, or at least this isn't the proof that that's the case. It might be the case. But as they point out, more than 24 didn't respond. That's 24 plus, so 25 is more than 24 at a minimum. And 2 declined to comment. So about 30 of the 65 haven't said anything at all. Out of the other half, 2, I mean, that's not a good record, said they would stand by him. But there'll be a lot more declined to comments, and a lot more people that they didn't even have a chance to reach. I don't know if they had, are they saying they found telephone numbers or contact information for about half of them, and out of about half of them, only 2 still support? What do we make of the 24 who didn't respond? Now, they might very well support him, but be afraid to speak out or something like that. It could be. Or, I was wondering whether there would be attackers out there saying, we don't know what this means. You call somebody over the weekend, they might not answer for a variety of reasons. They're busy. They have a life. They're hanging out with their family. They're at family functions. They're cleaning the house. Whatever they're not cleaning their own houses. Don't worry about that. I mean, they're all right. They're, playing squash. Who knows what they're doing with their time, right? Fine and dandy. Good excuse and all that. I just wanted to point out that, again, the story with getting 65 of them on a letter in one day, essentially, was that for whatever reason, 65 women who knew Brett Kavanaugh in high school, allegedly, if you believe their story on how that letter came together, were waiting by the phone, or at least pretty easy to get a hold of when you wanted to get a hold of them to sign a letter to support Brett Kavanaugh. It was not tough to find, contact, and get a definitive answer out of these women. Suddenly, they're very difficult to get a hold of and don't have very much to say. I think that probably answers that accusation about as well as it deserves anyway, because it's a pretty dumb counterpunch to say, well, maybe they were busy. Okay, maybe they were. Anyway, let's see. One other item that Greg sent, let's take a look at this one. Is it a raw story? Do I have to do it that way? Okay, don't crash my computer, raw story. Digby has written this one up for raw story. Let's see. Here's why the allegation against Kavanaugh is credible. Oh, okay. I have a feeling that, well, most of the audience believes it's pretty credible anyway, but it's always wise to pause and find out what Digby has to say. Well, he has smeared and attacked women before. Ah, okay. Well, then that's really something. And I don't know. Let's go see it. Does this have to do with physical attack or just, being a bad, jerky political operative? He attacked the integrity of other women. Who knows? Could be either one. Let's take a look. There's a quote up at the top here, I guess, from Senator Brian Schatz, speaking on Pod Save America, which I've never heard of, and might be another podcast if there is another one. Brett Kavanaugh is not just a conservative jurist. He's not John Roberts. He's not even Neil Gorsuch. He's a Republican operative who is posing as a judge. And that's a good call, Senator, or Brian, as we would like to call you. That's very, very true. I mean, like we were saying earlier, he happened to go to law school. He absolutely did do that. And he's been a judge. They handed him that. I think he might even arrange that, right? Wasn't he the White House secretary who was responsible for putting papers on the president's desk and moving them around and getting them to the right places? He put his name down on there and put it down in front of the president, and check it out. I got nominated to the D.C. Circuit. Wonderful. Fantastic. Good thing I went to law school. All right, let's take a look at this article from Digby here. After the news broke on Friday about an anonymous, decades-old accusation of sexual assault against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, Salon's Amanda Marcotte expressed little surprise at the possibility it might have happened, and she pointed out despite all the treacly paeans to Kavanaugh, the kindly basketball dad, his jurisprudence as a federal judge was enough to show his hostility to women's rights. It wasn't much of a stretch to imagine that he might have acted upon such impulses at some point in his life. After all, the president who nominated Kavanaugh for the high court has bragged about assaulting women, and more than a dozen have come forward to say that he wasn't idly boasting when he said that. During his confirmation hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee, Kavanaugh seemed to be as unconcerned with those allegations as the rest of his party. Of course, they hadn't brought them up yet, so we will see how he feels now. Over the weekend, Republicans circled the wagons. The anonymous accuser had named a conservative writer named Mark Judge as Kavanaugh's teenage accomplice in the assault. Judge came forward to say that he had, quote, no recollection of such an event, saying, "It's just absolutely nuts. I never saw Brett act that way." Now, that might be true, since Judge has written extensively about the wild, debauched atmosphere at the all-male prep school he and Kavanaugh attended in suburban Maryland, and admits to having been blackout drunk during that period. Well, you won't have much in the way of recollection then. That doesn't exactly help Kavanaugh's case, she continues. Neither does it help that Kavanaugh later joined the notoriously dissipated and drunken fraternity at Yale, there are several, and belonged to an equally licentious secret society that even today remains one of the few all-male groups on campus. And if you happen to come across another story that names that particular licentious secret society, you will likely gasp in horror if you don't know it already. We won't be reading it here. It's not in this, so I have an excuse. Plus also, oh my God, it's not for the air. Imagine having a secret society named that, though. Now I bet you're all intrigued. Maybe I'll tell you on Twitter if you ask nicely. None of that is evidence that Kavanaugh assaulted anyone, to be sure, but it does call into question the Boy Scout image his sponsors so assiduously created during his confirmation hearings. And that's really unfair to Boy Scouts. On Sunday, the woman who had lodged the complaint came forward to tell her story. She's a professor of psychology at Palo Alto University named Blasey Ford, and she told the Washington Post that she was the author of the letter detailing the alleged sexual assault by Kavanaugh and Judge in the 1980s, when all three were high school students. It's a harrowing story, which Ford's therapist had documented in her files years ago. Ford says she was reluctant to come forward because she knew it would make her life unbearable. She's undoubtedly right. Kavanaugh's defenders are going to come after her with everything they have. The Republicans are already shrieking about the Democrats playing dirty pool, which is as ironic as it gets. It was Republicans who threw away the rule book to hold a Supreme Court seat open for nearly a year so they could appoint a hard-right conservative. They are making the case that this unprovable accusation is unfair, and it's unprovable in scare quotes, is unfair because, as one town hall writer expressed on Twitter, let's see, who is it? Go on, tell me. Oh, I don't know who that guy is. Guy P. Benson. All right. Well, never heard of him. Anyway, I'm sure you have. He said, now you'll have heard of him because he said, I don't know how it would be remotely just to derail the nomination of someone who spent an adult lifetime building a personal and professional reputation based on this exceptionally thin standard. Bad tweet. Perhaps that's true, Digby continues, but it doesn't get Kavanaugh off the hook. In fact, it should make everyone go back and take a closer look at Kavanaugh's personal and professional reputation. When it comes to unfairness and character assassination, he's an expert. Here's just one example to illustrate the depth of his character deficiencies. Back in the 1990s, which isn't so far off from when he was doing this, conservative activists went to DEFCON 1 when Bill Clinton came into office. A whole group of young conservative lawyers joined the cause, Kavanaugh among them. His first big job for the government was as Ken Starr's point man on the Vince Foster case. Indeed, it was Kavanaugh who pushed for the investigation, even though Foster's death had been amply covered by congressional committees, the local police, the FBI, and the first special counsel, Robert Fisk, all of whom had found that the former deputy White House counsel had committed suicide. But Kavanaugh was deep in the right-wing fever swamp and argued to Starr that they could unscrupulously use the fact that there were unfounded conspiracy theories surrounding Foster's death to reopen the case, despite the grieving family's desperate pleas for the government to stop the outrageous innuendo and speculation for political ends. Kavanaugh was apparently particularly interested in Rush Limbaugh's odious suggestion to his legions of listeners that Foster had been murdered in an apartment secretly owned by Hillary Clinton, because she's just secretly owning apartments all over the place. He spent 3 years and $2 million attempting to dig up dirt on the dead man, at one point demanding that Foster's teenage daughter give the authorities specimens of her hair, an apparent attempt to prove or imply that a hair found on Foster's jacket had instead belonged to Hillary Clinton. And I won't even bother with the dramatic music on that one. That's the kind of guy we're talking about. Kavanaugh asked everyone involved about this non-existent affair between Clinton and Foster, even eventually Clinton herself. It later became clear that Kavanaugh knew all along that Foster had committed suicide and that he had used the power and resources of the independent counsel's office to lend credibility to a vulgar sexual rumor about the First Lady, in the process needlessly torturing the family of a dead man. Let's just say there's more than one way to assault someone. In this case, which is proven, he assaulted 2 women, Hillary Clinton and Vince Foster's widow, Elizabeth. As of this writing, we don't know whether Republicans on the Judiciary Committee will delay Kavanaugh's confirmation vote or reopen the hearings and call Christine Blasey Ford to testify. But if they are, depending on their nominee's reputation as an upstanding, honest, decent adult, to outweigh this accusation of sexual assault in high school, they're going to have to find another candidate for the seat. As Senator Brian Schatz said in the quote above, Brett Kavanaugh is not just another conservative jurist. He is a professional political operative with a past full of dirty tricks and character assassination. If there is any decency left in the Republican Party, there is not. This latest revelation will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Republicans are cheering. They're kicking the camel in the back. Believe me, they don't care one way or another. And I don't think for a moment that Digby thinks that they really do either. All right, just thought I would add that one to the mix. And let's see. Geez, there are a few more that I am certain we could include in this roundup. I'm just trying to see what is happening out there now so we don't miss out on any of the breaking news. Let's see. Kate Sherrill shares this one with us. As Greg was speculating before, we now have this news. Senator Donnelly saying the allegations made against Judge Kavanaugh are serious and merit further review. Given the nature of these allegations and the number of outstanding questions, I believe the Judiciary Committee should hold off on Thursday's scheduled vote. Wow. Going way out on a limb there is Joe Donnelly. Okay, well, he thinks there should be a delay. I thought it would be maybe more exciting news, but, well, we want to keep tabs in real time on what these guys are doing and thinking. Let's see. This brings up a whole other issue here. Hold on a second. Let me hang on to this one, Matthew. Let's see. That gave me a thought. And how are we going to deal with this one? There's a couple of things I have to say about this. Matt Rigdon sends us this one. What does it say about Kennedy? And we're talking about the current Republican Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, not Ted Kennedy or any other previous Senator's Kennedy. But, I'm sorry. I thought you were, okay. That reminds me of something else then. He's talking about Justice Kennedy. What does it say about Justice Kennedy that he supposedly resigned so Kavanaugh could have the seat? That's a good question. It says, I think, that Anthony Kennedy did not have any idea, for some reason, either had no reason to believe that there was such an issue, or was one of those people who thought, well, that's just what kids do in high school. I don't know which one. But I'm reminded somewhere back in my tweet stream would have been a tweet about Senator Kennedy asking him in the hearings. Let's see, where was this? When did this one happen? I was reminded, somebody, was it Georgia? Yeah, well, I think it was Georgia Logothetis who said, just sort of like tweeted out a reminder of that time last week when Senator Kennedy put questions to Kavanaugh, interestingly enough, I thought, about his days in high school. And he put the question to him very innocently. And here it is. Flashback to when Kavanaugh was asked by Senator Kennedy whether he was more of a John Boy Walton type or Ferris Bueller type in high school. And that's a very weird question and a very puzzling question. And I'm sure at the time everybody was like, this guy, what's wrong with him? Kind of a stupid question. You might as well ask what kind of tree he would be. But what an interesting question. And it may just have been an idle, stupid question at the time. But it may also have been an indication that just maybe Republicans really did know about this. And Georgia was saying, I think he answers the question rather nervously and fiddles with his watch and is kind of hemming and hawing. And it could be just because I wasn't expecting that as a question. But interesting that the high school thing would come up in the questioning from Republicans who claim not to have known anything about this or have prepared in any way for this kind of allegation. It seems like a weird thing to ask him, but what a weird backhanded way that would have been to put that one on the record. But, of course, you remember immediately conservatives all over the country screaming, outrageous! How dare you ask about anything having to do with such a period so long ago, back in high school? Why weren't we all Ferris Bueller types? We were not, of course. Interesting. I just wanted to put that out there as a weird thing to think about. We'll get back to what the other Kennedy thinks after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's follow up on Matthew Rigdon's question with a little conspiracy theory type news. I don't know if I can confirm this in any way. I put it aside because it's floating out there and, it would be irresponsible not to speculate. But this harkens back to a storyline that was raised earlier with regard to Justice Kennedy's resignation, but never really fleshed out. And then, of course, there was a period, you remember the whole connection between Justice Kennedy's son working for Deutsche Bank and questions about whether or not he had been involved in any loan making of a questionable nature to Donald Trump. And that never really panned out well. But I'm not positive, my recollection, I'm not entirely clear on whether that was just debunked, disproven, or just wasn't relevant enough to stay on, or it was maybe it was too tenuous a connection, and I don't know. But anyway, that theory has arisen again, and in a way that, like I said, I can't decide how I feel about it, but I wanted to put it aside. Obviously, I gave it enough credence to put it aside and read it, but my recollection is we may want to read it with a little bit of a jaundiced eye. But let's find out. I found this one from Cornelia, Paladin Cornelia, who some of you may follow along with on Twitter. And, that I find that Cornelia very typically has a pretty good finger on the pulse of what's being talked about and connecting the dots wise. Not necessarily among the further out of those, out there among those who trade in such things. And there are people who I think are considerably more speculative, let's say, but whom I follow along with anyway, because every once in a while they hit on something where I say, that's at least worth considering. And I guess this is one of them, but I don't put her that far out on the spectrum. But this isn't the New York Times reporting it here or anything. We can just be clear about that. Not that anybody out there really loves and trusts the New York Times' news sense all the time. You get what I'm saying. Justice Kennedy, the claim is here, wasn't planning to retire until word came out that his son Justin was involved in some shady banking with Trump and some Ruskies as well. Then Kavanaugh, a reliable right-wing operative who clerked for Kennedy along with Gorsuch, was financially polished up as fast as possible. Yes, going back to the story of how is it that he suddenly was able to clear up anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000 in credit card debt without any increase in his salary, without the sales of any assets, anything like that. And we got this ridiculous fishy story about, well, the reason I had so much credit card debt was I bought my buds a bunch of season tickets to the Nationals and just carried the debt for, a couple months or whatever. Oh, and by the way, they just paid me back. It seems to me, I would say this. I would want to be paid back a lot faster than that. I would not want to pay any finance charges on several $1,000s, $50,000+ worth of baseball tickets on anyone's behalf. I'd be a little bit concerned about that. But I don't know. Maybe in the country club set, they do this sort of thing. The best theory, I think, on all of this is, I guess Kavanaugh must come from a relatively wealthy family in order for him to have grown up in crime-plagued Bethesda and have attended Georgetown Prep and Ivy League schools, et cetera, and be a member of Congressional Country Club, which others have pointed out is a nearly $100,000 initiation fee. I think for whatever reason he was embarrassed about and didn't want to disclose just how much of his lifestyle, his family's wealth, I guess, pays for. But, it's a financial disclosure form. I'm sorry. You're going to have to fess up to these things. Don't give me these stupid, fakakta baseball ticket stories. Anyway, this is an interesting theory. Kavanaugh had to be financially polished up as fast as possible in order to fill this Kennedy seat, which became available because Kennedy was seeking to avoid staying in the spotlight long enough for his son to get in trouble. That's the theory here. And she's tweeted along with her comment what looks like a Facebook entry from John Kilafra, with whom I am entirely unfamiliar. But this is the tale as it's relayed here. Justice Kennedy was not planning to resign next term. We know because he had already appointed his clerks for that term. And that was a highly unusual aspect of the story. People do change their minds, but it's fairly unusual for, somebody who has a lifetime appointment and who knows that the judgment call on retirement is going to come from you. And also, it's a pretty important position, and a lot of people's livelihoods depend on your decisions with respect to the clerks, etc., and you don't appoint clerks and then drop them like that. It's just, I guess it happens. And who knows, maybe he got some information about his state of health that he wasn't expecting. And there are explanations. I don't know if we've gotten them, but there are imaginable explanations. So, Kennedy wasn't planning to resign, according to John Calafra, because he had gone ahead and appointed clerks for the next term. He suddenly resigned, though, this theory says, because his son worked for Deutsche Bank and, Deutsche Bank, I guess itself, indicted in the EU for being a conduit for money laundering for Russian oligarchs. He resigned because his son's client had been Donald Trump, for whom he had arranged up to $1 billion, it says here, in Deutsche Bank, quote, loans. Those funds likely were monies originating from Russian oligarchs connected to Putin being laundered through the bank with the knowledge of Kennedy's son. In other words, Kennedy's son could be ensnared in the Mueller investigation, perhaps vulnerable to indictment himself. In this eventuality, you can be certain that there will be appeals to the Supreme Court to dissipate the threat posed by the investigation. As the father of a potential target of the investigation, Kennedy would be forced to recuse himself, leaving his son's fate to a split court. That is to say, an 8-8 split court, with him recused. He knows that whomever Trump brings to the court, though, will come in with the intention of working to mitigate the effects of these of the investigation and certain revelations to come. This would imply that the administration knows that something is going to break in the investigation, and soon. It also puts all of Kennedy's judicial decisions relating to Trump under a dark cloud of conflict of interest. It's a lot of speculation. But as I understand the story, the idea here is that Kennedy's son, implicated supposedly in the lending practices of Deutsche Bank with respect to their loans to Donald Trump and loans of Russian oligarchs' money. And that if Justin Kennedy had anything to do with these loans, it would, of course, reflect very badly on Justice Kennedy, for one thing, but also might catch him up in Mueller's probe, and that at that point, any movement by the Trump administration to challenge the validity of the Mueller investigation in court that were to reach the Supreme Court would reach a Supreme Court from which Kennedy had recused himself, meaning a 4-4 split and no definitive way for the Trump administration to be certain in its anticipation of the Supreme Court's agreement with their contention, however stupid it might be, that the Mueller investigation was illegal or somehow invalid. But if Kennedy were to say, all right, the hell with it, I'll enjoy an early retirement, and he was to be replaced with a reliable fifth vote on the conservative side who would have no such conflict of interest, then the odds of Trump prevailing in court when he attempted to come up with a legal reason why it would be valid for him to put an end to the Mueller investigation, he'd come away a lot more cleanly than he would with a 4-4 split court. It's a theory worth considering, although, there's an awful lot of gaps between these dots, but, I don't put it past them. They've almost certainly considered at some level in the Trump White House, what's our standing? What are our legal grounds should this come to a confrontation in the courts where we say enough is enough? We assert a right here to fire Mueller either directly or through Rosenstein or whatever, however they want to engineer their putting a stop to the Mueller investigation, and it's going to be tested in court. How do we look? Because we're going to obviously look. I don't care what happens in the courts below. It's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. We're going to insist on it. How will we look in the breakdown of the court? Well, okay, except Kennedy is a little shaky because he might have to recuse himself because his son worked at Deutsche Bank, and whether or not he made any particular loans to Donald Trump, I guess you could probably build the case that, look, if he's a loan officer at Deutsche Bank and Deutsche Bank is already under suspicion both in the EU for money laundering and here in the United States. I mean, we've levied the biggest fine, I think, that American authorities have ever levied against a banking institution over money laundering charges. And everybody knows by now that Trump's lender of last resort, really, the only bank still willing to lend to him was Deutsche Bank. And his son works there and was a loan officer. That's probably enough to get to a recusal. So, I don't know. It's definitely worth thinking about. I don't know if I buy every bit of it, but it's enough that I thought I should throw it out there and have you guys mull it over and give it some consideration. Let's see. Going back to the way we handled things on Friday, actually, it's very interesting. We kind of left with some fairly serious questions, not unlike Susan Collins, I guess, in that sense, of questions about the handling of the story by Senator Feinstein. And there were some really interesting takes on all of this. And by the end of the show, I think we had come around to, well, it sounds like Senator Feinstein was under some instructions not to reveal the name of the accuser and not to go past a certain point in revealing information about the case. And that, as curious as everyone was about it, it was perhaps the right thing to do to honor that request and to proceed slowly, even though it would make Senator Feinstein somewhat uncomfortable and subject to questions about the validity of the charges, questions about the accuracy of the accusations she was making, and about her timing. In other words, it gives rise to attacks like those that Susan Collins has been busying herself with this morning. And there was considerable pushback, and we read a couple of tweet storms that really objected to the characterization in the news coverage of there being tension between committee Democrats and other Democrats on the committee and elsewhere in the Senate being upset with Feinstein's handling of things, but that this was perhaps very poor framing. In particular, I think the accusation was on the part of Ryan Grimm over at The Intercept. And I said, yeah, I'm not loving the way this is coming out, that's for sure. And then right afterwards, after the show ended, there were some more developments, I think, on that front. And people who were, I think, reasonably, let's say, disturbed by the way Feinstein had acted in this. So I want to now sort of provide, I guess it's not entirely back and forth here. I don't have anything from Ryan Grimm on his position on this, but I do have a couple other tweets that I think I grabbed on Friday, which I think are worth looking at. Jeff Hauser, who's maybe somebody that you also follow along with on Twitter, who made this comment. More than a decade that I'm aware of personally, as my knowledge goes back to 2007, he says, of more than a decade of professional progressive takes on Feinstein that have been self-censored for many reasons might finally break into mainstream media awareness by, say, close of business today. I will say great play on the part of Senator Feinstein, I would add, that this did not come to pass by the close of business Friday. She has largely escaped a lot of blame in this. What I have here connected to Jeff's tweet is the tweet of Will Stansel, a lawyer in his own right, and tweeting, I don't know whether he's a California attorney or not, but he's tweeting this screenshot here of, I don't know who's reporting this. Let me look back in his tweet storm. It doesn't say, but we could probably just Google up the text of it and get me the actual citation here. He says, he begins his short tweet storm. It's just two linked tweets here saying, I propose a trade. Kavanaugh withdraws and Feinstein resigns. And I guess is this the Intercept article that he's looking at? Feinstein's decision to handle the matters in her own office without notifying other members of the Senate Judiciary Committee stirred concern among her Democratic colleagues. For several days, Feinstein declined requests from other Democrats on the committee to share the woman's letter and other relevant communications. I also think I have another source of similar reporting, not the Intercept, but I'm not sure which one this is from. A source familiar with the committee's activity said that Feinstein's staff initially conveyed to other Democratic members' offices that the incident was too distant in the past to merit public discussion, and that Feinstein had, quote, taken care of it. On Wednesday, after media inquiries into the Democratic members multiplied and concern among congressional colleagues increased, Feinstein agreed to brief the other Democrats on the committee with no staff present. Then Will also comments here. Oops, I've got some auto-playing video somewhere. Let's see if we can kill that off. There you are. Who's responsible for that? The Hill, on a page that's been open for 2 hours now. Okay. But let's see. Will also commenting on the next paragraph here saying, which reads, sources familiar with Feinstein's decision suggested she was acting out of concern for the privacy of the accuser, knowing that the woman would be subject to fierce partisan attacks if she came forward. Feinstein also acted out of a sense that Democrats would be better off focusing on legal rather than personal issues in their questioning of Kavanaugh. To which Will remarks, without even touching the merits of the allegation? Why? Why on earth would anyone think this? There was a period there toward the end of the day on Friday where it was not looking very good for Feinstein, that she had decided on everyone's behalf that, yes, the counterattack by Republicans that this was so long ago, or he was a high school kid, and you can't blame him for that. That's just the way it was somehow a credible pushback. And that's kind of damaging, I think, all in all, and led to a lot of discussion about, well, you know what, maybe Feinstein's not really on it here. Maybe she's not really with it in all of this. And I wondered whether that might be a fair conclusion. Irene Carmon, who follows issues like this rather closely, pointing out, of course, Feinstein first won in what was then the first so-called Year of the Woman. Remember that one? She won in the Year of the Woman, fueled by outrage at the Thomas hearings. And that's true. And that's really kind of interesting. And she's pointing to the tweet of Rebecca Traister, New York Magazine writer, who says, Dianne Feinstein, for those of you who don't know that nickname, Dianne reportedly sat on this in part because she thought objections should not be, quote, personal, which recalls Joe Biden, mentioned earlier, and how he approached the Hill allegations against Thomas, and also should make us see how much has not changed about attitudes about assault and harassment. Very interesting, and it's part of a longer thread that also included a link to this piece here from The New Yorker, linking to a Ronan Farrow, Jane Meyer piece, who notably co-authored Strange Justice, the book on the Hill-Thomas hearings, a sexual misconduct allegation against the Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, stirs tension, remember that terminology, among Democrats in Congress. So that was the other source about which I mentioned the other just a few minutes ago, besides The Intercept, using that terminology again, saying tensions were high among Democrats in Congress because of the way Dianne Feinstein handled this. Luckily, the story, I guess luckily for her, blew up to such an extent and so quickly that has largely fallen by the wayside. But, to be entirely fair or as fair as I think I can be by reading a couple of excerpts that I found over Twitter on a podcast, as close to fair as I can be, I guess, in relying on that for my information. I think maybe there's still a little bit more room for having doubts about the way Feinstein handled this thing. Not, how do we even say this? I mean, I disagree entirely with the idea that we shouldn't be allowed to look this far back. And believe me, over the weekend there were a lot of insane arguments about why it might be a good idea to hold blameless everybody under age 18 for everything they ever do, as we sort of expunge juvenile criminal records, etc., when people attain the age of majority. But it produces a lot of rather perverse results. But it is, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if Feinstein sort of had that general approach to things. It's kind of outdated, I think, and not really in touch with where most people are on issues like this. And it is surprising, as Irene points out here, given that, what gave rise to Feinstein's rise to the Senate here and winning in the Year of the Woman and what was fueling that. I don't know. I'm just going to have to kind of leave it out there for all of us to consider. And I don't know how much longer Dianne Feinstein's career goes on, just given the natural progression of things. But it's worth considering that maybe she didn't do a fantastic job with this, and that it's, worth considering that perhaps she has some things to answer for in all of this. All right. Let's see. There are a few more things that we could do and still not necessarily leave the subject of Kavanaugh. And since we're close enough to the end of the show, we might as well just say, look, it's going to be an all Kavanaugh show at this point. We mentioned the baseball tickets thing and it being rather ludicrous. And we do have, let's see, we need to continue with reporting on this? I don't think so. I'll just bring up for the record that NYC Southpaw, Lupin, or however this is pronounced, you still got me. I might have to ask him eventually, did bring us this piece just before the end of last week. In addition to wondering why no one was going to ask about it, Kavanaugh apparently contradicted the White House's account of this credit card debt, raising more questions. So we'll just throw that one in here at the end of the show and maybe see if we can get the gist for what he did here. On Wednesday night, Kavanaugh offered answers for the first time to longstanding questions about his personal finances that had been prompted by significant credit card and loan debt noted on his judicial disclosure forms. Kavanaugh's explanation of his finances is not consistent with earlier explanations from the White House. Questions have lingered since shortly after Kavanaugh's nomination was announced in July, and reporters digging into his public record found that his financial disclosure form showed tens of thousands of dollars of fluctuating credit card balances, as well as a loan against his retirement account for the 12 years before 2017. And then all of these debts disappear from Kavanaugh's financial disclosures in 2017, and the forms didn't indicate an obvious source of funds to repay them. That's the basics of it. In July, Raj Shah for the White House explained the debts to the Washington Post this way. He gave them the season tickets for the Nationals story, put them on the credit card near the end of the year, collecting reimbursements the following year. That practice, along with some home improvement expenses, resulted in the large year-end balances that appeared on his disclosure forms. Shah emphasized that Kavanaugh's credit card balances were transitory and that he had discontinued the practice in 2017. He did not carry that kind of debt for over a year, Shah told the Post. But even really a couple of weeks would have been super uncomfortable. But I guess if the bill didn't, if it really was weeks, yes. Months, well, Anyway, how did he contradict it? Before his hearings last week, Kavanaugh and the White House declined to answer any further questions from reporters and senators alike about the nominee's finances. No senators asked about the financial situation during the televised hearings, but Democrats on the committee submitted several detailed questions in writing afterward. Kavanaugh's answers, released on Wednesday, contradict the White House account in many important respects. Over the years, we carried some personal debt, Kavanaugh wrote, referring to himself and his wife, but he denied that the debt was related to the baseball tickets in the way Shah had described, which would have amounted to loaning his friends the cost of their tickets until they got around to reimbursing him. That's true. That creates problems. Kavanaugh says he signed up for 12 years of national season tickets when the team moved to Washington, D.C. in 2005. He split up those tickets with old friends, whom he still declines to name, by the way. Wonder if it's any of his old party buds. Through a ticket draft held at his house. That's how they split them up. However, Kavanaugh wrote, everyone in the group paid me for their tickets based on the cost of the tickets to the dollar. No one overpaid or underpaid me for the tickets. No loans were given in either direction. The White House account implied that Kavanaugh had, in fact, loaned his friends the cost of the tickets for at least a month or two while he financed the expense on his credit card. Kavanaugh did not repeat that claim. After this story was published, a White House official called to say the administration's account of the baseball tickets is not in conflict with Kavanaugh's. Why? Well, because it's just not, I guess, was essentially their claim. So let's see. The Washington Post report from July, they said, is misleading. So it wasn't that we were contradicted. It was that you had it wrong, you Washington Post types. All along, the new account revives questions about Kavanaugh's overall financial situation and suggests he lived beyond what he could afford on his relatively modest income as a federal circuit court judge. The version told by the White House in July had addressed that question, but had the drawback that it struck many observers as unlikely. Many also noted the national season tickets simply aren't expensive enough to explain that significant debt. Kavanaugh's new story about his credit card debt has the advantage of being far more plausible, allowing for the fact that it paints Shah as, to put it politely, misinformed. Many people's finances are a balancing act of sorts. It's eminently believable that the Kavanaugh family ran up substantial personal debt on their credit cards while they're trying to juggle living on a judge's salary and maintaining a Washington society lifestyle, membership in a ritzy country club, etc. The new story no longer involves an eye-rolling account of a federal judge incurring high-interest credit card debt for unnamed friends, but it is notably missing the facts and figures that would allow others to verify the claims. For all its plausibility, Kavanaugh's explanation renews some of the serious concerns that Shah's initial account obscured. There's much more to read about that. I won't fit it in, but what a weird story to make up on your own volition inside the White House. Yeah, well, it's all about season tickets to the Nationals. That's going to get you in trouble.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
All right, well, we'll be back tomorrow, and I'm pretty sure we'll talk about things other than Kavanaugh, although who knows. I do have this to tell you, though. Next up, the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam, and you can be sure there's going to be some other items on the menu there. I can see how many of them there are. I am positive I'm not going to be able to tell you all about them, but they're not all about Kavanaugh, so stay tuned.